In a political statement, the living standards of the global north are sustained and made possible by the ecological and material exploitation and devastation of the global south. The breakdown of the study is as such. Drain from the south in 2015 amounted to $14.1 trillion when measured in terms of raw material equivalents, $5.1 trillion when measured in terms of land, $3.6 trillion when measured in terms of energy, and $20.3 trillion when measured in terms of labor. The best the researchers could say is that the value of the drain through unequal exchange in 2015 alone ranged between $3.6 trillion on the lower end and $20.3 trillion on the higher end. Drain from China alone, by the way, amounted to $2.4 trillion, comprising 22% of the net south-north flows. Between 1990 and 2015, the total drain sum amounts to $242 trillion. This windfall bears a stark and close resemblance to colonial forms of appropriation, albeit through different means. And of course, as previously mentioned, this amounts to roughly a quarter of Northern GDP during the era. Let's discuss aid. Overseas development assistance is a benevolent-seeming strategy of international development in which governments of the Development Assistance Committee commit to spending 0.7% of their GDP on aid. Of course, this is an ideological game that obscures a horrifying reality. To quote, "Our results show that net appropriation by Development Assistance Committee countries through unequal exchange from 1990 to 2015 outstripped their aid disbursements over the same period by a factor of almost 80. In other words, for every dollar of aid the donors give, they appropriate resources worth $80 through unequal exchange. From the perspective of aid recipients, for every dollar they receive in aid, they lose resources worth $30 through drain." This further reinforces the point. So-called poor countries aren't poor because of internal failings or vaguely racist justifications. These countries are overexploited, and charity is an ideological band-aid. A common objection is the claim of efficiency or labor form differences between the North and South that explains the differences seen above, supposedly. Southern production now spans every part of global commodity chains, from manual labor to managerial, engineering, logistical, IT, and other roles. Despite this, and I quote, "wage disparities are nonetheless so extreme that highly skilled labor performed in the South may even receive lower pay than quote-unquote unskilled labor performed in the North." The paper itself goes into depth about how measuring productivity by prices, which is the usual justification, amongst other things, is fallacious, but regardless, real productivity differences are minimal if they exist at all, and can't explain wage inequalities on their own. Furthermore, the gap between unit labor costs in northern and southern economies demonstrates that the difference in wages is greater than the difference in productivity. In other words, wage inequalities exist not because southern workers are less productive, but because they are more intensively exploited, and often subject to rigid systems of labor control and discipline designed to maximize extraction. This is pretty much the major reason why northern firms offshore production to the south in the first place, because labor is cheaper per unit of physical output. International economic manipulation. Let's discuss this. The main predictor of high export prices and net appropriation as a result is economic power internationally. In a term, basically, rich countries can maintain price inequalities because they're rich, simple as. Here's a long quote that explains this further, so pause if you'd like to read it. To summarize this section of the article, international economic manipulation is done through 1. Northern firms and countries leveraging monopsony and monopoly power to depress southern supplier prices while setting final prices artificially high. 2. Patents, of which 97% of all patents are held by corporations in the high-income countries. 3. Forcing people in the south to pay for access to resources they might otherwise have obtained much more affordably or even for free. 4. High-income nations exercising monopoly power in the institutions of international economic governance, with northern countries holding a majority of votes, for example, in the World Bank and the IMF, with the US holding veto power, etc., etc. Another example of this is in the World Trade Organization, where bargaining power is determined by market size, which enables high-income nations to set trade rules in their own interests. 5. Subsidized agricultural exports from the north, which undermine subsistence economies in the south, contributing to dispossession and unemployment, placing a downward pressure on wages. 6. Militarized borders, which preclude easy migration from south to north, thus preventing wage convergence. 7. Structural adjustment programs imposed by the World Bank and the IMF, which since the 1980s have cut public sector salaries and employment, rolled back labor rights, curtailed unions, and gutted environmental regulations, amongst many, many more. This, of course, doesn't even begin to mention active attempts which are successful in preventing the South from developing sovereign industrial capacity, meaning outside of subordinate positions in global commodity chains. Structural adjustment programs, free trade agreements, the various international economic and trade organizations that have forced governments of global South countries to remove tariffs, subsidies, and other protections for young industries, all of which are things the West in particular used in their development early on. Check out Ha-Joon Chang's work on this topic. Of course, I won't elaborate on assassinations or direct sabotage in this video. All of this prevents governments from carrying out something called import substitution, basically meeting a greater proportion of a country's total demand for goods through its own domestic production, which would improve their export prices and drive northern prices down. Tax evasion and illicit financial flows as well, of course, which amounts to more than $1 trillion per year, likewise drain resources that could have been reinvested domestically, or which governments could otherwise use to build national industries. All of this is worsened by external debt service obligations, which drain government revenue and basically leave economic policy in the hands of creditors. Furthermore, structural dependence on foreign investors and access to northern markets forces southern governments and firms to compete with one another by cutting wages and resource prices in a race to the bottom. Simply put, the usual explanations of how and why imperial periphery countries are poor are little more than ideology. The biggest roles played are by structural power imbalances in the world economy, which ensures that labor and resources in the South remain cheap and accessible to international capital, while northern exports enjoy comparatively higher prices. As a result, a significant drain of labor and resources occurs from the South, not too different from colonial periods, with the only major difference being that the former system was explicitly coercive and the current one is implicitly coercive. As the authors say, cheap labor and raw materials in the global South are not naturally cheap, as if their cheapness was written in the stars. They are actively cheapened. The limitations/further investigation section of the article discusses class and geographic inequalities within countries, resource consumption patterns and class background, corporate control of supply chains, and so-called internal peripheries within developed countries such as the US, all of which are possibilities for deepening the analysis. The call to action part discusses potential solutions along the lines of reparations for ecological debt and payments from the appropriators, the North to the South, amongst other things. In the end, they basically admit that capitalism is the fundamental issue here, and since class interests dominate, only revolution, socialism, and dedicated internal development of imperial periphery countries can solve this systemic international economic imbalance. I've made relevant videos about the above, so check those out. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Marcus Lanuson, Red Commissar, Adlan, Hamid Fehmi, Gavia 2000, Sushi Fushi, Victor Nguyen, Hackerman, Brisket, Eric Setterquist, Julian Kovacs, Weeb Trash, Missy Orlinsky, N3Asu, Ooga Booga, Jaybird, Chris Lisemeli, Eater Dude 420, Meiji, Noms Chomsky, Sean Stevens, Vegan Marxist, Jeremy Miller, Yuriton, ProlAF, Tomasz Olszewski, Luce Vader, Nicolo Guadagnolo, Shivaru, Salian, D, Furry Comrade, Mantis himself, Francis Fish, Gregory Samsa, Chemtrails Just Lines of Coke for Jesus, oh my god, Cthulhu on Ice, Dom, John Bataka, Ryan Brown, Box Cinnabon Badger, Pushtail, Will, Edwin Hermato, Venbog, Derek, Joseph Aboud, and Banana Man Ultimate. Thanks for watching.